400 years ago. You want to know that the state is going to stand up and say, no, sorry, that's not grounds for owning this land. You need to have the title, and the title has been bought, and we know it because it's recorded and that kind of thing. So it's predictable in the sense that it's stable. It's enforced in a way that's impartial. It's calculable in the sense that you can actually run the numbers and see how it's going to play out, right? You're going to be able to figure out what the taxes are going to be on a certain kind of production or the tariffs on a certain kind of trade. And you can figure that into your assessment of how to organize production rationally. And if the state isn't there to back up those types of claims in a rational way, you can't organize production in this fashion. This gets straight to Delaney's discussion of property and sovereignty. This is the same thing. But Weber is locating it historically as a necessary condition for the emergence of this kind of production. Is my microphone dying? It feels to me like maybe I'm just... Okay. Oops. And then fifth, free labor. Workers who in the formal sense voluntarily, but actually under the compulsion of the whip of hunger, sell their labor on the market without restriction. So this is a further statement and actually an expansion of the point a moment ago about a free market. We said there needs to be a free market, no irrational restrictions on trading, and I used labor as an illustration. Here he's going one step further. He's saying there must be a class of people who voluntarily, in the legal sense, sell their labor power, which is to say they walk in and strike a deal that is legally a deal between equals, right? They say, I want to sell my labor power to you. The other person says, I want to buy it. They agree on a wage, and they go to work. And in that sense, the worker could decide not to do this, right? But Weber's saying that fulfills a sort of condition of no irrational restrictions on who can trade their labor with whom, but it doesn't actually meet the full sense of what he's talking about here, actually under the compulsion of the whip of hunger, which is to say these people sell their labor power because they have no other way to make a living. They can't produce their own goods, their own food on their own. They have to sell their labor power to get money to buy the things they need. So this is quite explicitly Bernstein's second definition of capitalism, or more specific definition of capitalism. Are there questions? Okay. Finally, sixth, general use of commercial instruments to represent share rights in enterprise and also in property ownership. What does this mean? We've talked a little bit about this previously in connection with Bernstein. I've alluded to it already here today. He's saying, and this is, I mean, again, this is so normal to us as perhaps to seem scarcely worth mentioning. But Weber is very interested in this. He's saying you have shares. Ownership is mediated by essentially pieces of paper. Instead of saying, I own this factory, and it's just mine, and everyone acknowledges that it's mine, and therefore it's mine, you have a piece of paper that represents that factory. And that factory, in fact, can be owned by a whole bunch of people who each own a piece of the factory, which isn't to say that they each own a brick or each own one machine. It's to say they each own a piece of paper that represents, for example, 1/100th of the factory as a whole. There's 100 shares, and you own the factory by owning the shares, and the shares can be bought and sold in their own right. They can be divided up or put back together. There can be 100 shares one day and 200 shares the next day by simply declaring we're going to have a stock split. This factory is now worth so much more money than it used to be that we think we can have 200 shares, and they'll still be worth about what they were before. This happens all the time. This is what Wall Street is about. The buying and selling of representations of ownership that are themselves sort of equal parts. They're all indistinguishable among themselves for the most part. He's saying this is a necessary precondition for capitalism, that ownership in the rights of enterprise and property shall be mediated by these commercial instruments, these pieces of paper. This sounds a little odd, but basically he's going to say this is necessary because it allows you to do a whole lot of things that are hard to do otherwise. It allows for efficiencies in the buying and selling of ownership of things, the means of production in the first instance, but actually a variety of other things. Right? You can buy a bond, which is ownership of a stream of revenue that will be generated in the future by the tax powers of the state. You are essentially lending your money to the state, and the state is agreeing to pay you back with interest over time, and you have confidence that can happen because the state can assess taxes and collect revenue and have money to pay you back. You are buying a piece of that revenue stream. So he says to sum up, it must be possible to conduct the provision for needs exclusively on the basis of market opportunities and the calculation of net income. This is the rational, calculating, industrial provision of goods. Are there any questions? Let's take our 5-minute break now. Okay. So this slide is here simply to connect us back to Bernstein. I've already covered the first two bullet points. The third one introduces the term primitive accumulation, which is a technical term referring to the processes by which these classes of capitalists and workers came into being, and especially the commodification of land and labor, the turning of land and labor into things that can be freely bought and sold, disposed of in the marketplace. Now, there's a huge, complicated literature about primitive accumulation, and there's some debates about exactly how to understand it. It should be stressed that the term primitive here is actually a translation from the German, from Marx, and another way you could translate that term is original. So by primitive here, we don't mean to say that it's somehow brutish, although it frequently is. We don't mean to say that it's characteristic of primitive conditions. We mean to say this is the process by which land and labor become freely disposable property, and thereby create the conditions in which there's a group of people who have to sell their labor power, because that's all they own. They don't have other ways of accessing land or accessing the means of production other than to sell their labor power. Now, when we watch Black Gold, when we watch some of the other movies this semester, later on this semester, you should look for this. You should look for the variety of ways in which these two classes of people have been or are being produced in different parts of the world at different points in time. Because there's an enormous variety of ways this can happen, and there are an enormous variety of other conditions that contribute to making it happen in different times and places. So it's not like it's crystal clear everywhere. Land is now commodified. Labor is now commodified. It's actually quite messy and blurry. And this process is one that we need to think about for this part of the semester, because this is a way of thinking about how capitalist production spread out around the world on the heels of colonialism. You know, how did we get from slavery production of sugar to plantations that didn't employ slaves but instead employed wage laborers? Because a slave is actually not a wage laborer, because a slave cannot voluntarily decide to work for some particular person, and a slave typically is not paid, right? So how that happens is sort of the focus for the next chunk of the semester. Now, some of this history background for the case of how this emerged in England. Here's a map of Europe circa 1648, after the Peace of Westphalia. And you'll notice that many parts of Europe, France, Spain, England, Ireland, Portugal, these are nation states at this point in time. This middle part of Europe is not a nation state at this time. It's the Holy Roman Empire, but it's divided up into all sorts of sort of subunits. It's a sort of mishmash consortium alliance of different kinds of political organizations, still internally organized in a feudal fashion. What did Westphalia, what's the Treaty of Westphalia famous for? Anybody know? Isn't it? Yes. It institutionalized state sovereignty in the modern sense of the word. So you look at England and France, for example, or France and Spain. What happened here is the powers of Europe agreed that there should be territorial boundaries, and that each state would be sovereign within those boundaries. Those boundaries would be coterminous. And each state, moreover, would recognize the sovereignty of the other states within their territories. So this is a landmark moment in history. It brought everybody around the table to agree on a basic framework for political organization and international relations. Previously, there really wasn't anything international, right? You can't have anything between nations until you have a stable set of nations who can have relations between each other, right? Westphalia creates this framework. And our own sense to this day of what a nation state is, and notions of territory and territoriality and sovereignty, are all built on this framework. So it's an important moment. And what happened, I mean, it's important here that England and France, for example, were already nation states, whereas the rest of Europe, in many ways, were not, right? You still had the Spanish Habsburgs controlling these territories, the Austrian Habsburgs controlling these, this weird mishmash of the Holy Roman Empire. England, and we're going to focus on England, was organized internally as a nation state in this sense. It had a unified fiscal and judicial system, and it had had one for hundreds of years at that point. The fact that it was an island made it fairly clear what its boundaries were. Its borders had a kind of natural reinforcement. It had a legal system that was national in scale. Its laws applied to the entire nation and were not internally variegated by subunits such as different feudal holdings, right? And this legal system was fiscally coordinated with taxation and spending. You had a centralized state that assessed taxes and spent revenues at that national scale. These different components fit together, the legal structure, the fiscal structure, and the physical geographical territory of the nation state. It had a less expensive government than most of the rest of Europe. It was more efficient in the Weberian sense. The nobles paid taxes, which was not true in a lot of other parts of Europe. And this empowered the state in ways that were not true elsewhere. It really helps to be able to tax the wealthiest people in your nation, right? They've got the most money. If you can tax them, you stand a much better chance of being able to raise enough revenue to sort of have a powerful state. The nobility was not nearly as autonomous, as free to ignore or dispute the central government as was the case elsewhere in Europe. Heritable peasant tenure was replaced by negotiable rents. This has to do with the commodification of land. Instead of a system in which, as was the case under feudalism, it wasn't only the nobles whose claim to land ownership was heritable, in the sense that it could be passed down to subsequent generations. The peasants as well had a kind of heritable land tenure claim. If your parents worked as peasants on a given lord's land, you too had a claim to be able to work there. You were the lord's peasant, and the lord wasn't free to just pretend that you weren't. It was expected that the lord would actually recognize you as having a right to be there. In England, this got replaced. They said, no, we can actually have kind of deals. You can each strike a deal. The lord can go to you and say, all right, you can farm here, but you've got to give me a certain percentage of what you grow. And the peasant could say, well, no, I can't make that much this year. How about this much instead? And they could bargain back and forth, which is not to say that there were no disputes, but it was actually turned into a kind of case-by-case negotiable deal rather than just a across-the-board non-negotiable arrangement. And this allowed land use to begin to be decoupled from tradition. It became much easier for individuals to decide to change how much land they were going to farm, what they were going to grow, to negotiate with the owner of the land about how much they were going to pay, to make decisions based not just on, well, we've always done it this way, but based on what would make the most sense for us. Maybe we should redistribute who farms how much land here and think again about what should be grown, because there's an opportunity to make a more profit by growing corn instead of wheat, for instance. And this led, as early as the 16th century, to agricultural improvement, which is in scare quotes here, partially just to alert you to the notion that this is about efficiency. This is about calculation of rational decision-making in land use and land tenure, breaking away from a tradition-bound system of decision-making. One of the major products that was being produced on this land was wool from sheep. And initially, most of that wool was sold to France, primarily, where it was turned into cloth. But about 1400, the English began to manufacture their own cloth from that wool, to spin and weave it into fabrics. And as this industry grew, it made the production of sheep using extensive land use, which is to say using large amounts of land to raise sheep, growing pasture grasses and forage, profitable. It created a lot of jobs in the mills where this wool was being spun and woven, and it eroded the urban guild labor controls that had previously applied. It had previously been the case that there was a guild of laborers who did these things, who made textiles, and they controlled access to that market very strictly. That began to break down as more and more people entered this line of production. And the unified state, with its clearly demarcated boundaries and powers of taxation, was able to protect this nascent domestic industry by setting up barriers to foreign competition. So the British became a source of woolen textiles rather than simply a source of raw materials for other people's mills. There was a political revolution that took 48 years, the Glorious Revolution in the middle of the 17th century, latter part of the 17th century, which further encouraged improvement and industry. The biggest thing it did was abolish royal absolutism. What's that? The power of the king to simply say, this is how it shall be. The power of the king to declare whatever he or she, I should say king or queen, wants as law. Whether it's consistent with other cases, inconsistent with what happened last week or not. Royal absolutism, basically this was the initiation of the idea of some kind of check on royal power through the parliament. The feudal lords restricted their ability to exact tribute, which is to say payment simply for being the lord, the feudal lord, although of course they could still exact rent. It favored profit-making interests among a wide variety of classes, landowners, merchants, and manufacturers. So you got a kind of across the board of the elite in that society, all focused on rational, profit-seeking, productive activity. And over the course of hundreds of years, there was a series of laws passed by Parliament that consolidated the control of landowners over their land as private property, known as the Enclosure Acts. This basically said the aristocracy, the land that they own, they are free to do as they see fit with, including disposing of it, selling it, and including throwing